Good evening, YouTube, and welcome to the weekly economic update. Normally, I do this on Fridays, but this past Friday, I was on a flight back from. Oh no, I wasn't. I was on a train. I've been in 4 cities in the last 2 weeks, so I'm a little bit confused as to where I have been. But last week I was in Orlando. I gave a keynote at the White Coat Investor Conference. Earlier this past week, I was in LA. I did among other things, I did a recording on Emma Chamberlain's podcast. And then in the latter half of the week, I went to Washington, D.C. and did an interview with Georgetown professor Cal Newport, which you will be hearing on the Afford Anything podcast. All of that to say, I am back home from New York, and we're going to talk about inflation because there are some new numbers that came out, and we're going to discuss what these numbers are and what it means for your wallet. So first of all, in the 12 months leading up to January of 2024, which is just a fancy way of saying last year. Last year in 2023, the inflation rate, we have the official numbers now, the inflation rate went up 3.1%. So we've got the full 12 months of data, the year of data for 2023, and inflation was at 3.1%. Now, that is higher than the Fed's target rate, which is 2%, and we're going to talk more about that in a moment. But it is certainly significantly lower than where we were a couple of years ago. Now, in January, so again, we're taking our focus off of the cumulative number for the year. We're looking just at one isolated month. In the month of January 2024, prices rose 1/3 of 1%, 0.3% from, this is how economists talk, from the previous month, which was December, right? So prices in January rose 1/3 of 1% as compared to what they were in December. Now, 2/3 of that rise is a rise in the cost of housing. And that makes sense for January because there are a lot of leases that renew in January. There are a lot of, it's a time for payments, actually not just in housing, but generally, January is a very natural time for payments to rise because a lot of plans reset at that point. So in January, prices rose by 1/3 of 1%. Now, that is all according to figures from the CPI. And we're going to talk in a moment about these different type figures because depending on which metrics you're watching, you're going to get some different data. And we're going to dig into that. Now, the next update that we are going to get will be Tuesday, March 12th. And so if you are wondering what are the inflation numbers for the month of February 2024, we're going to find out on Tuesday, March 12th. Until then, January data, which I've just described, is the most recent data that we have. So again, we know that inflation over the past 12 months went up 3.1%, and we know that inflation in January went up 1/3 of 1% in that month. Now, let's zoom out a little bit. I talked about how these numbers come from something called the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. Now, let's talk about some of the different ways that we measure inflation because we get different numbers based on different measurement styles. The Consumer Price Index measures the rate at which prices go up for consumers, you and me. And it looks at 8 groups: food, housing, apparel, medical care, recreation, transportation, education, and communication. So looking at these 8 groups of expenses, it deciphers how much you and I are paying, how much more you and I are paying when we go to pay for any of these 8 things. But the problem is there are a couple of things that are on that list, specifically food and fuel, groceries and gas, that can be very volatile. And sometimes those can have price hiccups that are unrelated to inflation. So, for example, if there's a big weather event, right? There's a flood somewhere, there's a tsunami, there's an earthquake. That can disrupt food and fuel in the short term in a way that doesn't have any relation to inflation in the long term. Similarly, if there's a big geopolitical event like a war, that can also have huge price shocks in the short term that don't necessarily reflect inflation. And so as a result, there are 2 different ways that we look at the Consumer Price Index. There's what's called the headline CPI, and then there's a different one that's called core CPI, which is the CPI minus food and fuel, minus those more volatile elements. There's also, by the way, CPI. So CPI is collected by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. There's also a different federal bureau. It's called the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and they look at something called the Personal Consumption Expenditure Index. And so, personal consumption expenditures, that also it's different from CPI, but it also looks at what people, you and I, are spending. Now, there's a different set of measurements. It's called the Producer Price Index, or PPI. Producer Price Index looks at what businesses are spending. So, for example, all right, here's a can of Coke Zero, right? The Consumer Price Index would look at what you and I are paying for this can. The Producer Price Index looks at what the company itself is spending in order to make this can. So what are they spending on the aluminum? What are they spending on the plastic, the packaging, the cost of printing the logo, right? That's what the Producer Price Index looks at. So, the Department of Labor released a Producer Price Index report on Friday. And what they saw was that the PPI rose by the same amount in January. It rose by the same amount that the CPI did, 1/3 of 1%. Now, for the PPI, that's significant. That is the biggest increase that it has seen since last August. The other thing that it found is that if you look at what's known as core PPI, like PPI minus food and fuel, minus those more volatile factors, the situation's actually worse. Core PPI rose by 1/2 of 1%. And there's another way that they measure it where they look at the PPI minus food, fuel, and trade services. And when you strip those three things out, those three things can be very volatile in ways that don't necessarily have a reflection on inflation. When you strip those three things out, what they found is that PPI under that set of lenses rose 0.6%, right? So that's quite a jump when it comes to the cost that businesses, companies are paying for the products that they make, how much they're spending to create this, which is not necessarily the same as what you or I are spending to buy it. And of course, that matters because it impacts the profitability of companies, which has an effect, of course, on their stock valuations, and ultimately, over the long term, has a high likelihood of getting pushed into higher prices for us and therefore higher CPI numbers. Now, let's talk a little bit about the different ways that inflation plays out. So there are a few different ways that inflation actually happens, right? So, what causes inflation? There are a few different ways. There's what's called demand pull inflation. This is where demand exceeds supply. So something like housing, for example. In housing, we've seen for a long time now, we have seen demand exceed supply. Demand continues to grow. The population gets bigger, new household formation happens, right? And there's all of this new demand that gets created. And you see this, particularly with millennials. Millennials are the largest generation since the baby boomers. Millennials are significantly larger in population than their predecessors, Generation X. They're also significantly larger than Gen Z, right? Millennials, because they're the children of the baby boomers, millennials are an abnormally large generation when it comes to population size. Now, why that matters is because many millennials right now are at the age at which a lot of people buy homes, right? The oldest millennials are in their early 40s, and the bulk of the millennials are in their 30s. And so millennials are in a stage of life right now where a couple of things happen. Number one, you'll have a group of people who previously lived with roommates. So you'd have four people, all of whom are 32 years old, and they're living, the four of them are all living together as roommates. And then they decide, hey, we're 32, we all want to form homes of our own, right? So these four people who are sharing one single housing unit as roommates decide, because they're in their 30s, they decide that they're each going to have their own home. And so now you have what was once one unit of housing that turns into four separate units. Or let's say that these four people were maybe two couples that live together, and each couple decides, they were sharing a place for a while to cut down on expenses, but as they're approaching their mid-30s, they decide that they want their own place because they want to start a family. So each couple decides to move out and start their own home of their own. Now you have you go from one housing unit that they were sharing to two housing units, right? So in that way, demand for housing units increases, in particular with the largest with this large generation, the generation of millennials, being at that age where we are creating more housing demand. So that's an example of demand pull inflation. Now, there's also something called cost push inflation. Cost push inflation happens when the supply of something dwindles, even if demand stays the same. So you can have, you saw this during the pandemic when the cost of lumber went up significantly. And that wasn't because demand for lumber increased, it was simply because the supply of available lumber significantly decreased. Right. And so when we have things like that, when we have material shortages, lumber shortages, copper, we had the same thing happened with copper. There was this huge shortage in copper production. And as a result, the price of copper spiked. That's an example of cost pull inflation. So there is another thing, and that is inflation that is related to expectations. Now, this can take the form of what's called the wage price spiral. And that's where workers anticipate that prices are rising, so they ask for raises. And then because companies need to afford to give them raises, those companies have to raise their prices. And as prices rise, more workers notice that prices are rising and start asking for higher wages. And so it becomes a self-reinforcing spiral, right? That's the wage price spiral. And that's an example of inflation that comes not strictly from demand pull or cost push, but rather from expectations. And there are two forms of expectation related triggers of inflation. There's anchored expectation, and then there's unanchored expectation. So anchored expectation is something like the Fed's target rate, right? Remember earlier we said we were going to come back to it. Here we are. So inflation in the last year was 3.1%. The Fed's target rate is 2%. That's considered anchored expectation. The Fed wants a 2% inflation rate, and they are going to set their policies accordingly to try to create that. That's the goal that they're aiming for. Then there's also unanchored expectation, and that's what we have going on right now. So think of it as anchored is what we want and unanchored is what we got. So in those are the ways that inflation actually plays out, right? Those are the triggers that cause inflation. And the reason that I go into that, the reason that matters is because what we're seeing right now is a little bit of mixed signals. We're seeing that the PPI, the producer price index, so the cost that companies pay to create a can of Coke, that cost is going up faster than the cost that they're charging us, right? We as consumers are not paying as much as they as producers are paying, at least in the short term, at least based on January data. Now, will that trend continue? Time will tell. Like I said, the next set of data points are going to be released March 12th. So that's when we're going to know how February played out. But based on January data, we know that the producer price index is looking a little bit higher than anybody wants it to be. And so it's something that we're going to have to keep an eye on. Now, if you'll recall, the Fed is meeting, as we've talked about in previous live streams, the Fed is meeting they're meeting in March, and it's widely agreed that they're not going to do anything to touch interest rates at that point. And then they're going to be meeting again at the end of April, April 30th and May 1st. And if they move interest rates, most analysts agree, there's pretty wide industry consensus, that if they start reducing interest rates, the April 30, May 1st meeting will be the earliest point at which they'll do it. But we're going to have to keep watching this inflation data to get a sense of whether or not they'll even do it at that meeting, or if that might be too early. So all of that is to say, the interest rates that we're paying right now for car loans, for home mortgages, for credit cards, looks like that's here to stay for a while. I mean, there is nothing in the inflation data right now that is that positive. I mean, it's positive relative to where we were 2 years ago, but it's still not where we want to be. And that means that it's likely that rates are going to stay high for a while we try to bring inflation, the Fed tries to bring inflation down. And given the fact that jobs are so strong, the economy is going well, we're not worried about a high unemployment rate, given that that piece of it is secure, there is even more of a likelihood that interest rates are going to remain high for a while. So that's what it means for you as you're thinking through your plans for early 2024, as you're thinking through whether or not you want to make a bid on a home, whether or not you want to take out a loan for a car, as you're thinking through some of the decisions that you're going to make, you can pretty much expect rates to stay high for the first half of 2024. And that when they do start to decrease, it will likely be towards the middle of the year, and it will likely be fairly gradual. At least that's what we can infer based on the data that we're seeing right now. So that is our weekly economic update based on the latest economic data. Thank you so much for watching. Shout out to the people who are here live right now. Novelty Robot says, like the stream. Thank you. Coach Junior, yo. Thank you so much for watching live. Thank you for being part of the community. Make sure you like, make sure that you're subscribed or following this channel. And I will see you in the next weekly economic update. I do these once a week, usually on Fridays, once a week here on YouTube. So thanks so much for joining, and I'll catch you later on in the week.